In this video, we're going to talk about dependency injection. My name is Ganesh, and if you're new to this channel, consider subscribing for more content like this. What is dependency injection? Simply put, dependency injection is a way to provide or inject an instance of a dependency that an object needs, rather than having the object create an instance of its dependency itself. Now, what is a dependency? A dependency is simply a class or an object that another class or object depends upon. Let's see an example. Let's say we have a book service class in the business logic layer and a book repository class in the data access layer in a typical n-layered application. The book repository class contains a method called addBookCasing that book service wants to invoke. So we can say a book service object depends on a book repository object for its functionality. The book repository object is called a runtime dependency because a book service object only needs to use a book repository object at runtime. But what happens in most applications is that the book service class itself is responsible for creating an object of book repository. So now the book repository class is a compile time dependency for the book service class. Let's see some sample code to understand this better. I have opened up a Visual Studio solution with two class library projects in it. One for the business logic layer and another for the data access layer. In the business logic layer project, I have a class called book service, and in the data access layer project, I have a class called book repository. If you go to the book service class, we see it creates an object of book repository in its constructor. So just because a book service object needs to use a book repository object at runtime, the book service class itself ends up creating an object of book repository at compile time. This compile time dependency makes the book service class heavily dependent on the book repository class, or we say the book service class is tightly coupled to the book repository class. Now, tight coupling has many issues. One is that it makes the code hard to maintain. Currently, our book repository class uses Entity Framework Core for its data access logic. Let's say there's a change in requirements and we want to switch to Dapper. So we can go ahead and create a new class called book repository Dapper that contains Dapper specific logic, but then we have to make sure to modify the book service class to refer to the new book repository Dapper class instead of the old book repository class. Here we only have a single reference, so it is easy to do. But what if there were many classes that refer to book repository? Then we have to modify in multiple locations, so the code is now hard to maintain. Second, it's difficult to unit test our book service class. To test our book service class, we need an actual book repository object that sets up the Entity Framework Core DB context and establishes a session with the database. So there is no easy way to isolate our book service class and replace our book repository dependency with any test-specific dependencies. Now, for the book service class to refer to the book repository class at compile time, the business logic layer project contains a project reference to the data access layer project. And this is a violation of the dependency inversion principle. The dependency inversion principle is one of the 5 solid principles of object-oriented design. This principle states that high-level modules should not depend upon low-level modules. Both should depend upon abstractions. So the business logic layer project, which is our high-level module, should not contain a project reference to the data access layer project, which is our low-level module. So according to the dependency inversion principle, instead of the business logic layer, which is our high-level module, depending on the data access layer, which is our low-level module, we need to let both depend upon abstractions. An abstraction in C# is either an interface or an abstract class, but we will be using interface for our example here. This abstraction should be owned by the business logic layer, which is our high-level module. So in our example here, the book service class will use the iBook repository interface, while the book repository class will implement the iBook repository interface. Let's switch back to the code sample. Now I have rewritten my code sample so that the data access layer project now contains a project reference to the business logic layer project instead of the other way around. Also, in the business logic layer project, I have a folder called interfaces which contains a single interface called iBook repository. This interface defines just a single method called addBookAsync. Then if we go to the book service class, we see it contains a reference to this iBook repository abstraction. And inside the addBook method, it calls this interface's addBookAsync method. Now, this won't work just yet because we cannot invoke a method on an interface without providing any actual implementation. We will come back to this in just a bit. In the data access layer, I have the class book repository implement the iBook repository interface that's defined in the business logic layer, and the book repository class implements data access logic using Entity Framework core. Let's go to the book service class, and here we see there is no longer any reference to the book repository class. So our compile time dependency to the book repository class is gone. But what about the runtime dependency? A book service object still needs to use a book repository object at runtime. Well, enter dependency injection. We can use various dependency injection design patterns for achieving this. For example, we can use constructor injection. We can declare a public constructor that takes in as its dependency an iBook repository parameter. Now what this means is, any client or consumer that wants to instantiate a book service class needs to supply an object of a class that implements iBook repository into the constructor. The book service class does not care who is going to do that. All it knows is, whenever it is instantiated, it will receive an iBook repository implementation. But who is actually going to provide an iBook repository implementation at runtime? That is done by the composition route, which we will discuss in just a bit. We can store the passed in reference in the private field and also mark the field as read only so that the field is not modified outside the class's constructor. Next, we have method injection. In method injection, we declare a parameter to a method of type iBook repository and then use the passed in reference to call the addBookAsync method. So this means that whenever any consumer invokes this method, that consumer needs to supply an object of a class that implements iBook repository into the method. Then we also have property injection or setter injection that we can use to inject a dependency into a property. And finally, we have the composition route design pattern. To demonstrate this, I have added a Web API project to the solution. In the controllers folder, I have a Web API controller class called BooksController. Now we can definitely go ahead and define an action method that instantiates a book service class and passes in a book repository object, or we can let the books controller use constructor injection. So I've defined a public constructor which takes in a book service as its dependency, and it stores a passed in reference into a private read-only field. And note that in order to refer to the book service class, the API project needs a reference to the business logic layer project. Now, composition route is a component that glues up everything together. When the books controller class is instantiated at runtime, an object of the book service class has to be created and passed into the constructor. And when an object of the book service class is created, an object of a class that implements iBook repository also needs to be created and passed in. And we can refer to this creation of instances of dependencies as object composition, and object composition is a responsibility of the composition route. Composition route is a single place that is located as close as possible to the application's entry point method, which is main. So let's go to the program.cs class file which contains the main entry point method. A composition route can be implemented either using pure dependency injection or using a dependency injection container. In pure dependency injection, we create instances of dependencies manually. Whereas if we use a dependency injection container, the responsibility of object composition is taken care of by the dependency injection container itself. But we need to tell the dependency injection container what dependencies need to be instantiated when a particular type is requested. So for example, we can say builder.services.addScoped. Now scoped, transient and singleton are referred to as service lifetimes, and let us not worry about them now. And then we can pass in generic arguments book service, book service. So this means that when anyone specifies a book service as a dependency, say as a constructor parameter, then the dependency injection container needs to provide or inject an instance of book service into the constructor. Since the two generic arguments specify the same type, we can shorten the code like so. Next, we can say builder.services.addScoped and pass in iBook repository, book repository. Now we need to add a reference to the data access layer as well. So this means that when the book service class asks for an iBook repository dependency in its constructor, the dependency injection container will provide or inject an instance of book repository into the constructor. So putting everything together, when the books controller class is instantiated at runtime, the dependency injection container will provide or inject an object of book service into the books controller's constructor thanks to this line of code here. And when book service class is instantiated, the dependency injection container will provide or inject an object of book repository into the book service class's constructor thanks to this line of code here. So now you know why dependency injection is a way to provide or inject an instance of a dependency that an object needs, rather than having the object create an instance of its dependency itself. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching.